Sometimes a desire doesn't announce itself quietly. It arrives like a weight, a glowing, heavy thing pressing from somewhere deep inside, impossible to look away from, impossible to pretend isn't there. And in those moments, the question isn't whether the wanting is real, it's why it's so strong. I find myself fascinated by this, the pull toward the things we want most in life, the way certain desires can organize our entire inner world around them, bending our attention and our energy, and sometimes our judgment in their direction. There's something ancient in it. These longings weren't installed in us yesterday. They run deeper than preference or personality. Some of them feel wired in, like they arrived before we did, shaped by evolution, by lineage, by needs so fundamental they exist below the level of conscious thought. And that's partly what makes them so powerful. You can't reason your way out of a desire that lives that deep. What I've become more curious about is the shape of each longing. What exactly is it that I'm reaching for? Because the surface object, the thing it seems like I want, is often just the visible part of something much larger underneath. A desire for a specific person might really be a desire for a particular kind of being seen. A desire for success might be carrying decades of something unresolved about worth. The craving points at something, but it doesn't always point at what it appears to. And then there's the harder thing to sit with. Why certain desires have the capacity to pull us toward behavior we'd never choose from a clear and rested place. The exhausting chase after something that keeps moving. The willingness to pay costs that keep rising. The way a strong enough longing can make the unrealistic feel inevitable and the harmful feel justified. I think what's happening in those moments is that the desire has become louder than everything else. It's not that our values disappear. It's that the volume on one channel gets turned up so high that everything else becomes hard to hear. What I've found useful is developing a kind of relationship with my desires, rather than either indulging them completely or suppressing them entirely. A knowing relationship. Something closer to, I see you, I understand something about where you come from, and I'm deciding how much authority to give you right now. That's different from denial. It's more like a negotiation between the wanting and the larger self that contains the wanting. There's something almost respectful in that approach. Desires are information. They're often pointing at something real and legitimate. A genuine need, a real absence of valid hunger for more aliveness or connection or meaning. The question is whether the path the desire is pointing toward actually leads there. Sometimes it does. Sometimes the craving knows something true about what's missing. And sometimes it's offering a shortcut to a destination that can only be reached a different way. Understanding which is which, that's the work. And it's ongoing. It doesn't resolve cleanly once and stay resolved. The desires keep arriving, keep asserting themselves, keep making their case. The practice is in the listening, in knowing them well enough that their pull informs you rather than controls you. So here's what I keep wondering. When you think about the desires that have had the most power over your life, what do you think they were actually reaching for underneath the surface? And did chasing them ever get you there?
There's a particular kind of person, and I've been this person, who's more comfortable in the pursuit than in the arrival. The project that's almost finished but somehow never quite gets there. The goal that keeps getting refined just before it's reached. The relationship, the achievement, the version of life that stays perpetually one step ahead, and somehow that distance feels more like home than closing it would. I've been sitting with why that is, because on the surface it looks like ambition. It looks like high standards. It can feel from the inside like a noble refusal to settle. But underneath it, if you're honest, something else is sometimes happening. The chase has its own reward system. When you're in pursuit of something, you have direction. You have identity. You're the person working toward this thing. You have the particular aliveness that comes from not yet knowing how it turns out. The wanting itself is generative. It produces energy, focus, forward motion. And arrival, real arrival, dissolves all of that at once. So the mind very quietly starts to protect the wanting. It moves the goalposts. It finds the flaw in the thing just as it becomes obtainable. It decides that what it actually wanted was slightly different from what it's about to receive. The mechanism is subtle enough that it rarely announces itself as what it is. It disguises itself as discernment. What I find worth examining is the question of what the chase is actually delivering. Because if the pursuit is producing meaning, aliveness, a sense of direction and purpose, those are real things, real needs being met even if by an unconventional route. The problem isn't the wanting. It's when the wanting becomes a way of avoiding the vulnerability of actually having. Because having is exposed in a way that wanting isn't. When you're still in pursuit, the dream is intact. The version of the thing you're reaching for exists in its ideal form, unmarked by reality. The moment you arrive, it becomes real, which means it becomes imperfect, which means it can disappoint, which means you can lose it. Staying in the chase protects you from all of that. It's a form of safety dressed up as ambition. I've also noticed something about the quality of the chase versus the quality of arrival in my own life. The periods of most intense pursuit haven't always been the most alive. Sometimes they've been anxious, contracted, myopic, all of that energy pointed at a single fixed point on the horizon, missing everything in the peripheral vision along the way. Whereas the moments of genuine arrival, when I've let myself actually receive something, stay with it, inhabit it fully, those have had a different quality entirely. Quieter, more spacious, less electric, but somehow more nourishing. The difference between stimulation and sustenance. The chase at its best is how we become. It builds us, orients us, gives shape to our days and our years. But at some point, the question worth asking is whether you're chasing something or whether you've learned to need the chasing. Whether you're moving towards something real or whether the movement itself has become the point. So, I'm curious, is there something in your life you've been pursuing for a long time that part of you might actually be afraid to catch, and what you think would happen to you if you did?
Desire has a shadow side, and I think it's worth talking about, honestly. For me, desire has always carried a certain darkness to it, not because wanting things is wrong, but because of what it reveals. At its core, desire is a feeling of absence, a hunger signal, something inside registering empty and reaching toward full, a negative seeking a positive. And when that hunger gets triggered constantly, by the world, by other people, by everything we're exposed to, the emptiness can start to feel like the permanent condition rather than a passing state. Here's the uncomfortable part. We are observational by nature. We can't help it. We take note of what others have, where they are, what their lives look like compared to our own, and we process that contrast automatically before we've even decided to. It's wired in. Status awareness, social comparison, the constant calibration of where we stand relative to others, these are ancient functions. They helped our ancestors survive. But they were never designed for a world where millions of curated highlight reels are being fed directly into your attention every hour of every day. What happens to a comparison mechanism that was built for a village when you suddenly give it the entire internet? It doesn't scale well. I've watched people I care about genuinely suffer from this. Friends who scroll through images of other people's lives and feel the gap between what they see and what they have as a kind of personal failing. A quiet, creeping sense that they're falling behind, that their life is somehow less than, that they should be further along or richer or happier or more interesting by now. The phrase is old, but it's accurate.
Comparison is the thief of joy. And the cruelest part is that the comparison is usually not even real. It's happening between your full, unfiltered interior experience, every doubt, every difficult morning, every moment of uncertainty, and someone else's most carefully selected external presentation. It was never a fair contest. The emotion that lives underneath all of this, the one that often goes unspoken, is one of the more uncomfortable ones to admit to. The wish that you were living someone else's life, someone else's fortune, someone else's circumstances. It sits in the body quietly and does damage precisely because people rarely say it out loud. It just accumulates. What I've come to believe, though, is that this emotion, as creepy and corrosive as it can feel, is also transformable. Most raw emotions are. They're not fixed states. They're more like raw material. The same energy that fuels envy can, with enough awareness and redirection, become something that actually moves you forward. A clarification of what you genuinely want, a signal pointing at something real that's missing. A hunger that gets converted into building rather than consuming. But that transformation requires the first step, which is seeing it clearly, naming what's actually happening rather than letting it run in the background unexamined, and making deliberate choices about what you let into your attention, because the feed doesn't curate itself, and the algorithm has no interest in your mental health. So I'm curious, when you notice comparison creeping in and pulling at your sense of your own life, what does it feel like in the body? And have you ever been able to catch it early enough to turn it into something useful instead?
I've come to believe that emotions are not fixed things. They feel fixed in the moment. When you're inside a difficult feeling, it can seem like a permanent condition, a wall, rather than a weather system. But I've watched enough of my own interior life to know that what feels immovable at 9 in the morning can be something entirely different by the afternoon, sometimes without any deliberate effort at all. The question that interests me is, what happens when the effort is deliberate? When you actually decide to work with an emotion rather than simply endure it or react from it. I think of emotions as polymorphic, a term borrowed from science. It means capable of taking multiple forms. The same base material, the same underlying energy, but with the capacity to become something structurally different depending on the conditions it moves through. What that means practically is that in a feeling isn't just what it first appears to be, it's also what it could become. Envy, for example, is uncomfortable to sit with, but underneath its surface charge, it contains a very specific kind of information, a precise signal about something you want but don't yet have. If you can separate the pain of the comparison from the data embedded in the feeling, what remains is almost a blueprint. The envy becomes direction. Anger works similarly. At its rawest, it's reactive, contracting, often destructive if acted on immediately. But the same energy, metabolized, understood, redirected, becomes one of the most powerful fuels for change that a person can access. The question isn't whether to feel it, it's what you do with it once you've felt it fully. This isn't about suppressing anything or performing a kind of emotional alchemy that pretends the difficult feeling wasn't real. The transformation only becomes possible after the feeling has been genuinely acknowledged. You can't redirect something you're still pretending isn't there. What I've developed over years of sitting with my own emotions, the messy ones, the unnamed ones, the ones that arrive without warning and demand attention, is something closer to a working relationship with them. A practice of asking, what is this actually made of? What need is driving it? What is it trying to accomplish? What would it become if I gave it somewhere useful to go? The answers aren't always immediate. Some emotions need to be sat with for a while before they reveal their second nature, but they almost always have one. There's something almost alchemical about the process when it works. The heavy thing becomes lighter not because you forced it to, but because you understood it well enough that it transformed on its own terms. Grief held long enough and honestly enough often becomes a particular kind of love. The same feeling, with the loss at its center rather than at its surface. Fear, examined rather than fled from, frequently turns out to be excitement wearing the wrong clothes.
The raw materials shifts. I think most people have more capacity for this than they realize. The emotions aren't the obstacle to the life you want. In many cases, they're the fuel for it, unrefined and waiting for someone to learn their chemistry. So here's what I find myself wondering. Is there an emotion you've been carrying that you've only ever experienced as a burden? And what do you think it might become if you finally understood what it was actually made of?
Something has shifted in how I process my own inner life, and I want to talk about it honestly, because I think it's one of the more quietly significant things I've started doing. For most of my life, the journal was the tool, the place where thoughts went to be held, organized, examined. Writing things down has always done something. The act of putting the formless into words creates a kind of distance from it, a perspective that pure feeling doesn't offer. But a journal doesn't write back. What I've found with AI, with tools like ChatGPT and Claude, is something closer to a thinking partner. I'll write down a raw thought, something unresolved, something I'm trying to understand about myself or about a situation. And instead of the thought just sitting there on a page, it comes back to me expanded, questioned, reflected from a different angle. The journal became a conversation, and something about that changes the quality of the exploration entirely. I use it almost like a therapy session sometimes, pouring out something messy and half-formed and watching it get organized into something I can actually see more clearly. There's no judgment in the exchange, no social cost to saying the uncomfortable thing, no worry about how it lands. Just the thought and the reflection of it, going back and forth until something clarifies. The second tool I've started using is something I didn't expect to love as much as I do: AI music generation. There are apps now, Suno is one I use regularly, where you describe a mood, a feeling, a sonic atmosphere you're looking for, and it builds something back for you. I'll describe what I'm feeling that day, the texture of it, what I'd want the song to hold, how I want it to move. And it sends back something to listen to that often captures the feeling more precisely than I could have anticipated. What strikes me about both of these practices is that they're both fundamentally about translation, taking something interior, a feeling, a thought, a mood, and finding a way to give it form outside yourself. The journal did this, music always did this. What AI has added is responsiveness. The form talks back. The translation gets refined in real time. I've also found that the quality of what I get back is directly related to the quality of what I put in. Being specific, being honest, giving context, layering detail, resisting the urge to summarize what I feel in favor of actually describing it. That discipline of precise articulation has become its own practice, and I've noticed it's making me a better observer of my own interior life, not just a better user of a tool. There's something worth sitting with in all of this. The inner life has always sought expression in words, in music, in art, in conversation. What's new is the availability of a responsive medium that meets you wherever you are at any hour without requiring anything from you in return except honesty. That's a different kind of tool than any generation before us had access to. So I'm curious, if you could use AI to explore any part of your inner life that you've never quite found the right outlet for, what would you bring to it first? There's a skill that almost nobody talks about, and I've become quietly obsessed with it. The ability to describe what you actually feel, precisely, honestly, with enough specificity that the words do justice to the actual experience, rather than just gesturing vaguely in its direction. It sounds simple. It isn't. Most of us move through our interior lives at a fairly low resolution. Something happens, we register it in broad strokes: good, bad, uncomfortable, fine, and we move on. The label gets assigned, and the label closes the inquiry before it really begins. But the label is almost never the whole thing. I first started noticing this when I began crafting prompts for AI. When you write a vague prompt, you get a vague response. The output reflects the quality of the input with startling accuracy. So I started going deeper. Instead of writing, "I feel anxious," I tried to describe the actual texture of the anxiety, where it was sitting in the body, whether it was sharp or diffuse, what it seemed to be oriented toward, what memory or expectation it was pulling from. And the response that came back was proportionately more useful, more resonant, more like something that had actually been in conversation with the real experience rather than the shorthand version of it. But here's what I didn't expect. The practice was changing me, independent of any response I received. The act of reaching for precision about what I was feeling, refusing to settle for the easy label, staying with the experience long enough to find the words that actually fit, was doing something to my relationship with my own interior life. I was developing a finer resolution. Things I would have filed under stressed started revealing themselves as 3 or 4 distinct things that happened to be present simultaneously, each with its own texture and origin. Things I'd been calling fine turned out to have a quiet grief inside them that I'd been too busy to notice. The discipline of the prompt became a discipline of self-knowledge. And I think this is available to anyone, with or without AI on the other end of it. The practice is really just this. When you notice something happening in your emotional landscape, don't accept a first word that comes. Stay with it a little longer. Ask what it's actually made of. Try to describe it to an imaginary listener who has never felt this particular configuration before and needs you to be specific. What you'll find usually is that the experience is more layered than you initially registered. And something interesting happens when you find the right words for a feeling that previously had no name. The feeling becomes something you can hold and examine rather than something that simply washes over you. The articulation creates the distance that makes understanding possible. I think of it now as one of the more underrated forms of inner work available. No equipment required, no special conditions, just the willingness to slow down long enough to ask, "What is this, really?" And then the patience to stay with the question until an honest answer forms. So here's what I'm curious about. When you try to describe how you actually feel right now, not the first word that comes, but the real texture of it, what do you find underneath the label you'd normally reach for?
It starts with a mosquito bite, which sounds like a strange place to begin a conversation about the architecture of a life. But stay with me. There's a moment, familiar to everyone, where the itch arrives, and the impulse to scratch it is immediate, almost reflexive. The hand moves before the mind has even registered a decision. And sometimes you scratch. But here's the thing I've become quietly fascinated by, the times when you don't. There's a part of my mind that activates in that moment of restraint, something that intercepts the impulse just before it becomes action. I'm not entirely sure where it comes from. Maybe it's a kind of inner strength. Maybe it's the part of us that pushes back against our own more automatic nature. But when it kicks in, there's something almost satisfying about it, a small, clean victory. Because the itch doesn't go away immediately. You have to sit with it. And in sitting with it, you're reminded of something important, that scratching makes it worse. The relief is real, but temporary, and it always costs more than it delivers. The more you give in, the more the irritation compounds. That's impulse control at its most elemental. And once you start noticing it in something as small as a mosquito bite, you start noticing it everywhere. The harsh reply you almost sent, the extra hour of scrolling that didn't need to happen, the purchase made from restlessness rather than actual want, the conversation you joined that you knew would drain you. Each one of these is a scratch, and each one follows the same logic, immediate relief purchased at the cost of something larger. What I find genuinely interesting is that impulse control isn't about suppression. It's closer to a pause, a gap, however small, inserted between the trigger and the response, long enough for a different part of you to weigh in. That gap is where choice actually lives. Without it, behavior is just reaction dressed up as intention. I've started thinking about this in terms of daily structure. What are the conditions that make the pause more available? For me, it comes back to the things we've talked about elsewhere. Sleep,
the morning hours held intact, the slow burn of delayed gratification, the practice of sitting with discomfort rather than immediately resolving it. Each of those practices in their own way is training the same muscle, the gap muscle. What I've also noticed is that impulse control compounds in the same way that scratching does, just in the opposite direction. Each time you insert the pause successfully, the next pause becomes slightly more available. Each small act of restraint builds a kind of residue of self-trust, a quiet confidence in your own ability to choose rather than just react. And over time, that residue becomes something structural, something that shapes not just individual moments, but the whole texture of how you move through your days. The mosquito bite is almost a gift when you think about it. A daily opportunity to practice the thing, to feel the itch, to notice the impulse, and to choose, even for a moment, to be the part of you that doesn't scratch. So I'm curious, when you think about the impulses that have the most consistent pull over your daily life, what would change if you could reliably insert just a few more seconds between the trigger and the response?
Nobody talks about the small things, the tiny decisions that don't feel like decisions, the barely noticeable moments of restraint or follow-through that pass without acknowledgement because they seem too minor to matter. But I've become convinced that these are the things that matter most. There's a principle at work underneath all of it that I keep returning to: compounding. Most people understand compounding in financial terms, small amounts of money consistently added, growing over time into something disproportionately large. But the same mathematics operates in behavior, in habit, in the invisible architecture of who you're becoming. Every time you insert the pause before the reaction, something small is deposited. Every morning you protect that quiet hour before the world arrives, something accumulates. Every craving held off a little longer, every impulse examined before being acted on, every small promise kept to yourself that nobody else even knew you made. Individually, none of these register. Together, over time, they become a person. What I find most interesting about this is the self-trust component, because that's what's really compounding underneath the surface behavior. Each time you do what you said you would, even something tiny, even something only you witnessed, you're making a deposit into a kind of inner account, and the balance of that account determines something important: how much confidence you have in your own word to yourself, which turns out to be the foundation of almost everything else. The reverse is also true and worth sitting with. Each small capitulation, the scratched itch, the skipped practice, the impulse acted on before it was examined, makes a different kind of deposit. Not catastrophic on its own, but the account is always running, always adding up, always compounding in whatever direction you're feeding it. I've started paying attention to the ratio. Not obsessively, but with awareness. Am I making more deposits than withdrawals today, this week? Is the direction I'm moving in, across the small moments, the invisible ones, consistent with the larger person I'm trying to become? One thing I've learned is that the compound effect doesn't require perfection. It requires consistency at a rate that slightly exceeds the erosion. You don't have to win every small moment. You just have to win enough of them, often enough, that the net direction is forward. There's also something worth saying about the time scale. Compounding is invisible in the short term. The person who has been making small daily deposits for 6 months doesn't look dramatically different than they did at the start. But at 2 years, at 5 years, the distance between them and where they began is extraordinary and almost entirely explained by things that seemed too small to count at the time. This is why the unglamorous stuff matters. The morning held intact, the pause before the reaction, the craving met with patience rather than immediate relief, the private discipline that produces no applause and no external validation. All of it compounding quietly in the background, building something that eventually becomes impossible to ignore. So here's what I keep wondering.
If you traced your last 30 days of small decisions, the ones nobody saw, the private victories, and the quiet capitulations, what direction would you find they've been compounding toward?
There's a distinction I've been sitting with for a long time. Two words that look almost identical from the outside and feel completely different from the inside: reaction and response. A reaction is what happens when the gap closes, when the trigger arrives and the behavior follows so quickly that no real choice occurred in between. The sharp word fired back before you knew you were angry, the defensive posture that assembled itself before you'd assessed whether the threat was real, the decision made from the feeling rather than from anything considered. Reactions are fast, automatic, and they feel justified in the moment because they're usually powered by something genuine: a real feeling, a real irritation, a real fear. The feeling isn't the problem, it's the speed. A response is something different. It's what becomes available when the gap holds, even briefly, even imperfectly. The same trigger, the same feeling rising, but something intercepts the automatic route and routes it through a different process. Not suppression, not performance, just enough space for a question to form. Is this how I actually want to handle this? The cost of habitual reaction is something I've had to look at honestly, because it's not just the obvious damage, the relationship friction, the regretted message, the escalation that didn't need to happen. There's a subtler cost that accumulates underneath all of that. Every time you react from reflex, you're confirming to yourself that the feeling is in charge, that the stimulus has authority over the behavior. And that confirmation compounds the same way discipline does, just in the wrong direction. What I find worth examining is where the reactive patterns live, because they're rarely random. Most people have a handful of reliable triggers, specific kinds of criticism, particular tones of voice, situations that reliably produce the same automatic response regardless of context. The triggers themselves are often old, built from something that happened long before the current situation, running on logic that made sense once and hasn't been updated since. The reaction is always present tense. The wiring underneath it is often not. Developing the response habit is slow work. It starts with the recognition, catching yourself mid-reaction or just after, noticing what triggered it, noticing what the automatic route looked like. That awareness is the first deposit. Over time, the recognition point moves earlier in the sequence. Eventually, with enough repetition, you start catching the trigger before the reaction has fully assembled. And in that window, however small, response becomes possible. What becomes available on the other side of this practice is something I find genuinely hard to overstate. Relationships change when the people in them stop being at the mercy of each other's triggers. Decisions improve when they're made from considered choice rather than defended reflex. The whole texture of moving through difficult situations shifts from reactive survival to something more like deliberate navigation. Viktor Frankl wrote that between stimulus and response there is a space, and that in that space lies our freedom. I've found that to be one of the more practically useful ideas I've ever encountered, because the space isn't something you have or don't have, it's something you build. So, I'm curious, when you think about your most consistent reactive patterns, the ones that show up reliably in specific situations, what do you think is actually driving them underneath? And what would it mean to finally respond from that place instead of just reacting from it?